And one of the things that we've published on is experimentation. So this is, I've got a screenshot here of a 2015 report that we published called Better Public Services Through Experimental Government, which made the case for why government should experiment in order to be more effective. And I'm actually in the process of producing at the moment a report on kind of the nuts and bolts of experimenting for organisations of all kinds, with loads of really interesting examples from charities and services in many different countries across the world, which is why I was really excited to do this webinar, trying out some ideas in the report. But I thought it would be useful to start with kind of giving a bit of background to Nesta's take, I guess, on why experimenting is a useful approach for organisations. So I think firstly, experiments are useful because they help us make smarter decisions by understanding what's effective. So knowing what practices, policies, ideas and solutions work and do good in the world and not harm. So they allow us to operate basically as organisations on the basis of evidence and not guesswork. Secondly, experiments are a really good way to test ideas early. So before kind of rolling out solutions onto kind of whole groups of people that we work with through our programs, experiments help us kind of refine the practicalities of our ideas in practice before we offer them at scale. Thirdly, experiments are a really useful way of breaking down really, really complex problems that can feel kind of insurmountable into more tractable issues that can be addressed. And lastly, there's many great examples of ways in which people are using experiments in order to be more responsive to the public, to users, staff, and stakeholders. So this is the kind of structure of the talk. I'm just going to move my face out of the way of my screen. Yeah, so I'm going to start by covering what is experimenting. I think you're all from kind of fairly different backgrounds, so I'm starting quite general, and then I'll look at how experiments work, some basics of good experimental design, and then at the end just cover a few examples, ideas and challenges before there's hopefully a chance for you guys to ask questions or raise any comments. So depending on where you're working, you might be kind of hearing a lot about experimentation at the moment as a kind of an approach to doing things, and it's definitely become a bit of a buzzword. So I think it's important to be really clear about what we mean by experimental research. And there's a kind of basic division in kind of social science research between experimental research and observational research. Experimental research aims to learn by making planned interventions in the world and understand what's happened as a result. So it's a way of kind of learning from action. As opposed to observational research, which unsurprisingly is about learning about the world by observing it. So here we have a kind of Collins English Dictionary definition of an experiment: a test or an investigation, especially one planned to provide evidence for or against a hypothesis. So traditionally, researchers make a distinction between kind of lab experiments and field experiments. Lab experiments are those done in artificially created environments usually, so we could think of the scientists in a white lab coat, and field experiments which are conducted kind of in the real world. And there's a really great book which I'll give you guys the link to later if you're interested, that points out that in the last 10 years there's also a distinction between kind of analog and digital experiments as another kind of axes of the location of where experiments are taking place. So experiments are about testing ideas and hypotheses in order to learn, and the starting point is a really well-defined problem or idea. So I guess you're starting to think about how to experiment, you want to be thinking really clearly about what the problem you want to solve is, what it is you want to learn, and how you can break up really complex issues into kind of tractable hypotheses. Now, because experiments test ideas in the world in a structured way, they're a really ideal method to make claims about causality or cause and effect. And that's kind of one of the main uses for experiments that we see, particularly in kind of policy and practice. So when we observe a change in the world, it can be really hard to isolate the kind of cause of a change from what researchers call confounders. So these are sort of competing variables and other explanations and factors that influence outcomes that we see. And a key factor in kind of good experiment design is how successful the experiment is at reducing confounders and allowing us to make cause and effect statements with more confidence. So I'm just going to say really briefly about why cause and effect is important and why we should use rigorous experimental designs when we're aiming to kind of solve problems in the world. This is a graph from the Comprehensive Child Development Program, which was a 1990s US social program which provided home visits for families in poverty with a newborn child. And the dark line on the graph there shows employment outcomes for home visited mothers over 5 years of an evaluation study. And it shows a really impressive rise from 16% in employment to 40% in employment. So research or an evaluation that takes those figures at face value would show that the program had kind of been a really great success. Now, this study was actually conducted as an experiment and as a randomized controlled experiment, which is one type of experimenting we'll kind of talk more about later. And that dotted line that you see on the graph is the control group. So the control group actually experienced an almost identical rise in employment rates over that time. So despite kind of seemingly good outcomes, the intervention actually really wasn't making the difference for young mothers that its organisers wanted it to. And if a rigorous experimental design hadn't been used, then we really wouldn't have been able to know that and wouldn't have been able to address the success of the programme. So I think the message here is that when we are aiming to make interventions in the world and solve public problems, not all research and evidence is born equal, largely because different kinds of research have different approaches to addressing and combating bias. Obviously, that's an issue that has kind of different types of relevance depending on what we're aiming to do, and that is something that we'll come back to. So, yeah, I'm not going to spend too long on this slide. So while experiments investigate cause and effect, there are lots of different types of questions that organisations are using experiments to answer. And this is kind of, that's actually the outcome of some recent work that we did at Nesta, looking into the different ways in which organisations are using experiments. So people are using experiments to test ideas, so to test assumptions and a theory about how the world works and the mechanisms of change that underlie the work of organisations and their interventions. Also to test the feasibility of new solutions, so to find out if new ideas have potential. So that might be a more kind of exploratory, slightly looser way of experimenting that kind of looks for unexpected consequences rather than definitive answers. There's also lots of organisations using experiments to improve their process, so to test changes in how something is delivered, looking at kind of immediate outcomes like whether a solution is kind of reaching participants rather than ultimate impact. And then it's the last category of testing impact, which is really kind of commonly talked about in the policy world as one of the main uses for experiments, which is testing whether a solution has been effective at improving outcomes or whether one solution is more effective than another. So we can kind of think about these questions on a bit of a continuum from exploration to evaluation. But I guess really the relevance here is that as well as being really clear about the question you're asking, you should also think about the kind of question that it is and how, if it's a question about theory, if it's kind of an early stage exploratory experiment, or if it's about effectiveness, and having clarity on that can help inform your design. So moving on to how experiments work. Parts of this might be a little bit technical, but hopefully not. So there are three basic kinds of experimental design, from pre-experimental through to full experimental. So example of a pre-experimental design that is quite common at the moment is a prototype. Then there are quasi-experiments, for example, using a synthetic control group, through to full experiments like a randomized controlled trial. And as you can see from the arrow that's on my left, there's kind of increasing causal power or increasing ability to make claims about cause and effect as you kind of move down that chain. So full experimental methods are the ones that allow us to make the strongest claims about cause and effect. And you can also, I guess, map those methods, broadly speaking, although not perfectly, onto the kind of aims of exploration versus evaluation. So pre-experimental methods are generally more useful for kind of exploring ideas and setting up new hypotheses than they are, well, definitely than they are for evaluating a project. So I'm going to run through the different designs really quickly. First, pre-experimental design, which is also called a within subject design. And that basically works by having one group of participants who are researched before an intervention. Baseline data is gathered, and then experimental intervention or treatment is made, and researchers or the organisation would aim to find out what happened after. These designs don't use a control group, they don't randomise, and they don't have very high kind of causal power, so they don't allow us to make, they don't have many mechanisms in place to kind of reduce the kind of confounding factors. So all pre-experimental designs kind of share that problem, but there are really, really interesting, important examples of pre-experimental research to develop new theory, explore new ideas. And using a pre-experimental method is certainly absolutely no excuse for kind of bad experimental design. So you are really aiming to understand, learn and measure everything about what's happening before, during and after the intervention. But wherever possible, it is kind of recommended that you try and use controlled experimental designs. Quasi-experimental design is basically one that uses a control or comparison group that's not randomly assigned. So there's lots of different ways of creating control groups, and there'll be some kind of further reading that you can do on this if you're interested in finding out. Some of them are quite kind of technical and use statistical techniques, others are a bit more straightforward. But there's, for example, matching techniques, which would be where you would find people who are not in your program or part of your intervention, but who are statistically similar to people that are, so you can kind of compare characteristics. Or now, especially in health, lots of people are using kind of available administrative data to construct control groups to make comparisons. So quasi-experimental designs do have a control group. They don't use randomization, and they have kind of medium causal power, to be really kind of simplistic about it. So full experiments are kind of sometimes called true experiments in the world of evaluation and social science sometimes. And these use a control group that is randomized, and they have the kind of highest causal power. So participants within one group of participants will be randomly allocated to a treatment and control group. And randomized experiments are aim to create kind of the fairest possible comparison between the two groups by allocating people to them by chance. So it aims to balance out differences between the groups in a way that's particularly effective to ensure that any changes we see as a result of the experiment are really kind of to do with the changes that we're making and not to do with whatever other kind of cause and effect mechanisms are in place in the world and happening all around us anyway. So I've kind of simplified these three designs. There are obviously other ways of conducting experiments. So this is a mixed experimental design, and it's kind of it's recommended if you're going to do like a randomized experiment, and that is just where you would take baseline data for both the control and the treatment groups before the experiment, so that you're able to compare both what happens within each group and between each group. So that's whenever it's possible, that's definitely kind of recommended as the best design for a randomized trial or a quasi-experiment. So those are the three main designs, and you've got a handy arrow going underneath to show you increasing causal power. So where are we? Yeah, so we'll kind of come back to that in the next section, but we're going to look now at these basics of experimental design. And firstly, what makes a good hypothesis, which is way more challenging, I think, than it sounds. So it's like, yeah, I'll come up with a hypothesis, but it's really hard. So there's kind of three basic principles for formulating hypotheses, which are simplicity, testability, and tractability. I've got 3 slides on this, and I'm not going to run through all of them, but kind of in red on this slide, I've got some examples of what not to do. So under simplicity, I've created the example of a new idea to increase the uptake of a digital health solution. What not to do in simplicity is kind of take a really, really huge question like digital participation is not equally available to people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, ethnicities, genders, ages, and locations. That's an absolutely massive issue, and there's no way that a hypothesis can meaningfully test kind of all of those different things at one time. So it's about breaking up issues into really small chunks, making sure that they're testable and tractable. So I guess the main messages are: don't be overambitious, be really, really clear about what you want to measure and how, and also create a hypothesis that you and your team can kind of feasibly test. So it's kind of really, really tempting to obviously be really ambitious when we're doing things that we care about. But I think when it comes to putting those things into practice, it's better to be kind of cautious and kind of do it well, rather than try and create a hypothesis that then becomes really unmanageable when we try and design a test for it. So a really simple way of kind of formulating a good hypothesis is using the statement, if X, then Y, which I think you might have already spoken to Eva about. And if it's something that you're kind of struggling with, or that you want to kind of make sure that you do really, really well, I would really recommend that you use, think about using a logic model or a theory of change. So if you haven't heard of them before, a theory of change is essentially a planning and evaluation tool. It's really, really simple and useful, and it helps you develop a clear rationale and explanation of what you're doing and why. So it helps you map out your strategy, inputs, outputs, and the outcomes you want to see. So kind of seeing that process depicted in that way can be really helpful for, firstly, defining hypotheses, and secondly, working out what you would need to be able to measure in order to test them. So, so I put this slide up because a hypothesis is a research question that sets up a test. And unlike other kinds of research, in some ways, experiments are things that we can and should fail. So if you're creating a good experiment and a good test, you should almost be giving yourself the kind of best possible chance to be able to disprove your hypothesis. So this makes experiments a really great way to learn, as Yoda says. But I guess think really carefully about whether you're setting a hypothesis that genuinely puts your work to the test. And if you can't fail your experiment, then it's probably not an experiment. So I guess experiments are really about being quite brave and kind of embracing failure, and thinking about what kind of approach you can take that really puts what you do to the test in a meaningful way. So the next point under the kind of basics of design is about bias, and that's something that we, I guess, touched on in the first section when we were talking about cause and effect and confounding factors. So bias is when ideas or evidence about something are skewed or unfairly weighted in one direction or another. Bias can be present in experiments if they're not well designed, and will affect the strength of its findings. It can lead researchers to overestimate or underestimate the effects of an intervention. And when we're designing experiments, we should be aiming to reduce or eliminate bias as much as possible, so that we're producing results that are balanced and fair. And also if we're working in public organisations or charities, so that we can kind of be sure that we're really doing the best that we can be for the public and with our money. The last point under this bit about design is, let's check what time I'm on. Okay, we're okay. Okay. Is about validity. So I won't go into huge amounts of detail on this, but I guess as kind of overarching points for thinking about the way that you approach your experiment, I find thinking about validity is kind of really key to coming up with a well-designed experiment. There are three kinds of validity. Firstly, internal validity. And internal validity is about basically the confidence and the success with which you can say that you've established a cause and effect relationship. So it's about whether the experimental process was performed correctly in a way that makes the test administered valid. So this is one of the strengths of lab experiments. They enable really kind of precise and clear testing by kind of controlling the environment that the experiment happens in. Secondly, we have external validity. This is sometimes called transportability or generalizability. And this is really about the extent to which the results of your experiment will travel or can be applied in other places and at other times. And this depends on really lots of different kinds of things. The question that was asked, the sample size, the composition, also things like the generalizability of the context in which the experiment took place. So if the experiment was about a really unusual setting, then it's perhaps more likely that the results won't be applicable to other settings. And also experiments that are based really strongly in theory tend to have better external validity because we have more understanding of why we're seeing the changes that we do. And thirdly, construct validity. I think this is quite often sort of overlooked when people are designing experiments, especially in the world of kind of practice and policy. So this is the extent to which theoretical concepts that form the basis of an experiment are accurate and make sense. And so whether you're actually really testing what you're aiming to. And this can be really difficult because experiments sometimes test quite abstract constructs, like you could be testing something to do with poverty, like what is poverty, how are we defining that, have we understood and measured it correctly? So I think it's really important to be clear about the concepts that you're using, how you define them and how you intend to measure them. And I mean, it's worth saying that these, especially internal validity and external validity, they're really, really hard things to achieve. There's lots of trade-offs to be made between them. And I guess these are kind of more a set of challenges that you need to think through rather than anything that there's like hugely straightforward answers to, unfortunately. So finally, just some examples before I hear from you guys. So firstly, I expect most of you have heard of randomized control trials. These are kind of the most well-known experimental design. They're used in impact evaluation as well as for other things. And they provide the most robust estimate of the impact of the program and help us understand what works and what's effective. One of the real kind of challenges of randomized control trials is that they're really expensive and they can take a lot of time. They involve a lot of expert knowledge and input. So you usually need a research partner or a university. And there's an example, the little green booklet on there of a randomized trial that Nesta ran called Creative Credits. And that gave that was a trial of a scheme that gave businesses vouchers to collaborate with creative partners to see whether that increased how innovative they were. And I think the results show some of the kind of real value of experiments, which is that after 6 months, there was really, really great results and it looked like these organizations were now really innovative. But after 12 months, there was actually no difference in outcomes. So randomized trials are really valuable because they allow us to understand the way things work over time. So another example of a really common type of experiment is an A/B test. This uses the same design as an RCT to test really small tweaks in design or implementation, often online. So an A/B test is a really simple way of finding out what users prefer by showing them kind of different options and randomly assigning a particular design or communication strategy to different groups of users. We can then compare response rates to see what was most effective. So A/B tests are being used all the time in business, anytime that we go to the Google homepage or that we log on to Netflix or that we use our bank, most probably. What we're seeing when we look at a screen online is an experiment, and that the company will be showing different users loads of different versions of a site or a platform to see what's most engaging. There's also government and non-governmental organisations all over the world using these kinds of experiments as nudges, like the Behavioural Insights team here in the UK. And these experiments are really showing how we can use kind of cheaply or freely available data that is collected digitally to design really robust experiments with really big samples, actually really, really cheaply. So another approach to experimenting that I mentioned once already is prototyping. Prototyping is a newer experimental approach that comes from the field of design. Prototypes were mainly used in kind of the commercial world to develop products before they've recently been used more widely in services and in public policy. And prototyping is a kind of earlier stage approach to developing new ideas and exploring how feasible they are, often involving users and stakeholders. So this graph on the screen is from a Nesta guide called Designing Public Services, and it takes you from a kind of concept level prototype through to a works-like prototype. And I think prototyping fundamentally is an experimental kind of approach because it encourages us to reframe ideas as hypotheses. And live prototyping is, I think, where the more kind of structured experimenting comes in. So a live prototype would be creating a lo-fi, low-cost version of an idea that can be tested at small scale. So this could be a version of a website or a new online toolkit, which can be trialed, feedback gathered, and then reiterated. And finally, the last example I've got was one from AI and a recent experiment by Google DeepMind. And I think this is interesting because I think it really shows some of the value of starting small and then kind of working up towards bigger experiments, which is an approach that lots of organizations are taking. So DeepMind ran a really small scale experiment through a research partnership with Moorfields Eye Hospital. They tested whether algorithms trained by machine learning could be as good as human experts in detecting eye conditions. And I think this was a small scale trial, so they tried it literally with 50 images. The software looks promising, and now DeepMind are looking to use it to see if they can use it to enhance the kind of collective intelligence of clinicians in another small experiment. And if that's successful, they'll then go on to kind of more rigorous testing and larger clinical trials before it's rolled out. So I think that's it from me, Eva. And I hope that made sense. Yeah, I'll mute myself.
Great. Yeah. Thanks very much, and that was great. Really helpful. I think there were loads of elements in there. I know it was a lot of information, so we're definitely going to share the both the video of the the recording and also the slides, and I will also dig out the resources that Anna mentioned in case you want to have a look at that, and send all the links in an email so you don't have to look for them yourselves. Okay. So if there are any questions, maybe I mean, it doesn't matter, like it can be quite specific to your particular case if you want, because we have like 25 minutes left, so actually there's loads of time. So make best use of Anna being here and having time to reply to your questions. To avoid people all talking at the same time, maybe just type that you have a question or something, and then like we can just like go in the order. That might be most useful. So I just give you guys a couple of minutes to digest all what we just heard. Chris, perfect. Okay, Chris, you just go ahead and start with a question that.
Okay, thanks. I needed to find my unmute button. I get the difference between the different experimental designs, but what
Chris, are you there? Because I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, see if I'm muted your microphone, but I still weirdly cannot hear you.
Okay, can everyone else hear me? Because I
can hear you.
I can hear you. Okay. Can you hear me?
Unfortunately, I can't hear you, Chris. I don't know why. Oh, maybe that's why. Did you have your audio on, right? Because I put it off. Oh, that's why. Okay, sorry. Chris, can you say, are you still?
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Okay.
There we go. Sorry, yeah, we just had both our audio because we thought, because otherwise it's interfering. Sorry, okay.
Yeah. Cool, thanks. So I get the difference between all the experimental designs, but what if you think that doing a control group is not worth the additional effort, or where you work with another organization where it would be really hard to sell them the idea that you have to keep one class out, for instance, because we're working with schools. And if we were to do this match control group well, we would ask a similar class to stay out of the intervention as opposed to the ones that we do the intervention with. But what if we think that there isn't that much to be had from having a control group? What if the effect size that we're seeing in a before and after comparison would tell us whether our intervention did something or not? Do we then do we then have the freedom not to not to go for a control group, or do you strongly want us to go with a control group?
Yeah, do you want to maybe? Oh, yeah.
Sorry, Eva, you're muted at the moment.
Okay. So Eva might be best placed to, I guess, answer your concern about about kind of CCID's advice on how important it is for you to use a control group. There are, of course, cases where it's not possible or feasible to use a control group. And I think if you can kind of provide a clear explanation of why that is, and what kind of, I guess, like extra efforts you might be going to make sure that you understand what's happening in your before and after study, then obviously there's an additional expense associated with creating control groups. Like regarding what you mentioned, that you're working with schools, and that having a control group might mean kind of one class or one group not getting the intervention. There are actually loads and loads of different ways of designing controlled experiments to make sure that doesn't happen. So you could do something like introduce the experiment in one classroom and then a few weeks later introduce it in another, and then you essentially have a control group for those 3 weeks or however long, while it's active in one classroom and not active in the other. And there's kind of lots of different variations on that kind of design. So for example, a stepped wedge, which is where experimental conditions are kind of introduced almost in like a kind of falling out structure to different groups over time. There's also kind of waiting list designs where participants can be allocated to waiting lists and given interventions in turn. So what I would say firstly is that there might be kind of fairly simple ways around the objection of not everyone getting the intervention, because there are ways to design experiments with control groups where everyone does get the intervention. And secondly, in terms of whether you will learn the same thing or not, I think if everyone can get it, by creating a control group, you're giving yourself kind of a huge amount of really interesting extra data and information. And if that can be done, I think it's always worth it. And also it gives you, to be frank, it gives you, I guess, more weight in kind of making the argument for the value of what you do, and the success of your experiment and what you've done. And I think that that's something that's really valuable, externally for funders, for stakeholders. And also, I'm not familiar with exactly what you're doing, although I did have a look at some of the stuff that you sent in before, but going into it assuming that you will get a large enough effect size not to need a control group is also more risky. You might be able to detect more sensitive changes with a control group and kind of actually set yourself up for success a bit better that way, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Chris, was that helpful? Because I feel like I would have basically said what Anna said. I think your experiment is quite unique in the way you're setting this up. And obviously this webinar is, kind of covers the different kinds of experiments. So all of your projects, actually all of your experiments are quite different. So it's difficult to kind of say, like they will all have like kind of individual way of how to best go ahead with it. But as like I would suggest, so what Anna just said regarding that kind of doing it in a staggered way, almost like having one classroom now and then like 3 weeks later, basically just introducing the other one, because obviously it makes sense that all the children get the intervention. That would be one way of approaching it. I would suggest just like play around with it a bit, and then kind of digest a bit what we just taught you, and play around with it, and then come back and we have a discussion in like 2 or 3 weeks time and see in what way we best can kind of move it to make it actually really a strong experiment, and then decide if a control group is necessary or not. But obviously, as Anna said, I think the risk will be minimized if you have a control group. That's for sure. Was that helpful?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Very helpful. Thank you very much.
Great. I think Daisy had a question.
Unmute. Yeah. Hi. Yeah, thanks. That was that was very helpful. I just wanted to follow up with from Chris's question. Like, maybe it sounds really stupid, but what is the difference between a baseline research and a control group experiment? I just wanted to know, because you did mention, like, as a pre-experimental kind of design, it's just baseline research and there is no control group, whereas when we move into the quasi-experimental, that's when we have control and experimental sort of comparison. And then I just have also another question, which is about indexes or index, what would be good ways of choosing indexes to measure, say, certain effectiveness or efficiencies, if that is something that we are trying to measure? And I'm asking that because within a larger sample size, I think it's easier to demonstrate that change. And maybe it's at a later stage, we might be able to say, oh, X amount of people made this kind of difference, and we're able to sort of demonstrate that. But within a relatively small sample size for this experiment, like, what would be a good way of setting these indexes? Thanks.
So Daisy, just checking that I've understood your first question. Were you asking the difference between the kind of pre-experiments and the quasi-experiments? Like the after and the quasi-experiments?
Oops. Sorry, no, I just wanted to have a quick check the difference between a baseline research group and having a control group.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a good question, and in practice it can be like a tiny bit blurred. So the general distinction is that with a baseline measurements, you're taking those measurements from the same group that you're then going to go on and kind of do the experiment with. So, you know, you have a group of people that you're doing an intervention with, you do research or take like baseline measurements to find out what's going on with them, do the experiment, you measure after. With a kind of a quasi-experimental control group. With a quasi-experiment, the people who you would be measuring would not be in your participant group. And there are loads and loads of different ways of constructing that control group. And they would be measured then over usually an identical time period, or if not an identical time period, then a kind of time period that was justified for kind of statistical reasons. That you would be comparing to, and it's difficult to, so there's lots of different quasi-experimental designs that I guess all approach this in slightly different ways. So with something like statistical matching, you could be aiming to imagine that you have, like, you've got 5 participants, for example. I mean, that's if you imagine you have 5 participants, you might be aiming to identify 5 non-participants, sorry, that were statistically similar to those participants in order to make a comparison. Whereas baseline data is about the group that you are working with. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Can you say it again, Daisy? Sorry.
The second question?
There we go. Sorry, can you say it again? Yeah.
So yeah, that answers perfectly my first question. And I still have the second question. Sort of like, what are the tips for setting good indexes for outcome measures within a small experiment and a small sample size?
Yeah. So yeah, you're totally right that it's really challenging with a small sample size to work out what to measure and how. I think the best way, it's hard for me to kind of say what I think good outputs to be measuring are without knowing the project, but I think the best way of approaching that would be to do some really detailed logic modelling. And I think if you can get a really, really clear picture of the way that your hypotheses, your kind of activities and strategies and inputs are fitting together with your outputs, then that would be the best way to kind of defining a measurement strategy that would make sense for you. I would keep it to the things that you're aiming to measure. So you obviously will be going for kind of proxy measurements most likely, and not measurements on kind of ultimate impacts. It's probably, with a small sample, it's probably not going to be viable to try and measure like whether or not you've, I don't know, made someone like happier at work, or made a kind of student better. So it would be, those are like questions that are likely it's not going to be possible for you to answer with a small sample. So I would pick intermediate measures that you can get kind of reasonably reliable data on. And those might be measures, depending on what it is, about kind of engagement or about participation, rather than on, but basically I think it's establish kind of proxy measures for outcomes, so intermediate measures that you can get reliable data on, rather than kind of trying to measure a really nebulous impact for a smaller scale experiment.
Yeah, that's great. Can I just ask, are there any resources where we could, or maybe you could recommend some resources for us just to read up on?
Yes.
Yeah, so definitely. So on this, I don't know if you can see the further resources screen that I've shared now, but there's a guide there, a really useful guide to creating a theory of change from New Philanthropy Capital, and also government website has an introduction to logic modelling that's quite useful for kind of going through those stages of working out what to measure. And then I put this book up that I read really recently, actually, called Bit by Bit: Social Research in the Digital Age. So if any of you are planning to do experiments online, I would really, really recommend that book. It's got a great chapter on designing experiments in it. Nesta has a publication on designing randomized control trials if anyone's going to go for a randomized experiment. And then this guide to testing social policy innovation is produced by the Alliance that I work on, and that covers lots of different quasi-experimental methods. I'll have a think if there are any other resources that come to me. In an ideal world, the publication that I'm working on will be finished soon enough to share it with you guys. But we'll yet to see if that will happen. But I'll have a think with Eva if there's anything else that it would be useful for us to share.
So now you can hear me. Sorry. So I said, as soon as they have published the report, obviously we're going to share it with you as well. That might just not time-wise not just match really well. You probably all will have kind of design experiments when this comes out, but still obviously it might be useful for further future work. And we're going to have another thing, as Anna said, about if we find another resources, because obviously I think that this whole logic models, that's just a really good way. Like, it's a really good way of structuring thinking, I think, like not necessarily only for the experiments, but in general, whatever projects you're going to work on, if you kind of want to make sure you achieve the impact and all that kind of stuff. So that's helpful. Are there any other questions? We still have like 8 minutes left until we get kicked out of the room. So is there anything else? Otherwise, obviously, you can always just come back to me and email me and then speak to Anna, and we try to answer your questions as best as we can. But otherwise, I would just like to suggest take in what we've just talked about, have a look at the resources if there's anything helpful, play around with your experiment design a bit, and then just get back to me if you want like a sounding board and feedback on where you're standing. But I think most of the kind of issues that we have identified with you individually beforehand that you have to work on, I think that should all be covered in that presentation, what we just heard from Anna. So that's, yeah, hopefully that's going to be helpful for you to work a bit further on that. Okay, it looks like there are no questions left, which is great. I mean, we still have time, but like obviously if everything's clear, that's even better. Okay, then I would just say, yeah, I'm going to send you all the resources. this afternoon or tomorrow. And then, yeah, if there's anything else you need or have follow-up questions, just email me and we'll figure it out.
Eva, will you be sharing the recording of this?
I will, yeah, I will.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so you can go back to the
Amazing.
explanations.
Yeah.
As well. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries. Okay, cool. Great. Then I say that's it. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks, Anna, again for helping out on that. Yeah, and I'll send you the resources and then you can work with that.
Yeah, good luck with your projects, everyone. It sounds really exciting.
Okay. Have a nice evening, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye.